the morning we departed. The air hung thick as wet wool against our faces, and I remember thinking that the Amazon itself seemed reluctant to let us pass. It was March of 1801, and the world beyond these waters was busy redrawing its maps and waging its wars. But here, in this green labyrinth, such concerns dissolved like sugar in rain. Our expedition comprised 6 souls, each carrying their own reason for venturing into waters that the local traders spoke of only in whispers. I was there as expedition naturalist and surgeon, a position that afforded me both authority and isolation. The others came to me with their ailments, but rarely their fears. My journal, bound in wax canvas and already swollen with moisture, would serve as our official record, though I suspected even then that some of what I would witness would never find its way into any formal report. Captain Joao Duarte commanded our venture with the stern efficiency of a man who had spent 20 years navigating Brazil's interior waterways. His face was the color of teak, carved with deep lines that mapped every flood and drought he'd survived. He trusted his instruments more than intuition, his charts more than the warnings of indigenous guides. This quality, would it serve him well on larger rivers where European knowledge held sway, would prove less useful in the territory we were about to enter. Father Celestino accompanied us as spiritual guardian and secondary botanist. He was a Jesuit of the old school, educated in Coimbra, who had spent 15 years amongst the native peoples and had adopted some of their ways whilst retaining all of his faith. His cassock was patched and sun-faded, his crucifix worn smooth by anxious fingers. He possessed that peculiar combination of gentleness and iron, with that marked the best of his order. Sergeant Paulo Ramos represented military authority, on loan from the garrison at Barcelos. He was young, perhaps 25, with the swagger of a man who had yet to meet anything his musket couldn't solve. He cleaned his weapon obsessively and spoke often of his prowess, as young soldiers do when they've seen limited action. I found him exhausting but reassuringly normal, a touchstone of the world we'd left behind. Our guide, Arauja, was a man of perhaps 40 years, though the forest aged people in ways that made such estimates unreliable. He belonged to the Bear people and knew the rivers as intimately as the veins in his own hands. He spoke Portuguese with a careful precision that suggested it was a language he used primarily for commerce rather than thought. His cousin, Davi, was perhaps 15, all sharp angles and watchful silence. The boy moved through the canoes like water itself, never off balance, never wasted motion. We traveled in 2 canoes, each carved from single tree trunks and riding low with our supplies, sacks of farina and salted pork, a brass-bound chest containing surveying instruments, another for collecting specimens, gunpowder wrapped in oilcloth, and a crate of glass vials that I packed myself with layers of straw between each one. Every item had been weighed and accounted for. Captain Duarte saw to that. But weight was only one of many concerns on rivers where the water itself seemed to resent intrusion. Our stated objective was straightforward. Map a chain of tributaries leading to a remote lake that appeared on no Portuguese charts, but featured prominently in trading gossip. We would take astronomical bearings, collect botanical specimens, document native settlements, and return before the seasonal floods made passage impossible. The Crown paid us to extend its knowledge into the blank spaces on the map. Those vast interior regions marked only with speculative illustrations of fantastical beasts. The irony of that last detail would not become apparent until later. The tributary we entered that first morning was no wider than London Street, though far more sinuous. The water ran black as porter, stained by tannin from rotting vegetation, and possessed a peculiar quality of stillness that made our paddle strokes seem like violations. Branches met overhead, creating a tunnel of green shadow broken by occasional shafts of light that fell like solid bars to the humid air. Within an hour, we had left behind any sense of the main river's breadth and power. Here, everything closed in. The air tasted decay and growth simultaneously. That peculiar Amazon combination of death-feeding life in an endless, accelerated cycle. Fish rose occasionally, dimpling the water's surface before disappearing without a splash. I saw electric eels coiling near submerged roots, and once, a caiman that watched us pass with eyes that reflected our images back at ourselves. We paddled in relative silence, the only sounds being the rhythmic dip and lift of wooden paddles, and the soft percussion of water dripping from their blades. Captain Duarte consulted his compass and sextant at intervals, making notations in his own journal with a carpenter's pencil that he kept sharpened to a lethal point. Father Celestino murmured prayers that might have been in Latin or might have been in one of the indigenous languages he'd learned. Ramos sat with his musket across his knees, occasionally checking the priming, though we'd encountered nothing more threatening than mosquitoes. By midday, we reached our first sign that the river held more than fish and water birds. The clay bank rose perhaps 2 feet above the waterline, a raw orange color that contrasted sharply with the surrounding greenery. Scored into this clay were marks, deep, parallel grooves that ran from the water's edge up onto bank and then back down again. Each groove was perhaps 2 inches wide and perfectly smooth, as though something had pressed itself into clay with enormous weight. River otter, suggested Ramos, though his voice carried no conviction. Araujo stepped carefully onto the bank and crouched beside the marks, his fingers hovering without touching. He measured the span between grooves with his eyes, then looked back at the water with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. What leaves such marks? I asked him directly. He was silent for a long moment before responding. Many things grow large here, senor. The forest is generous with size. It was the kind of answer that provided no information whilst confirming that information existed. Captain Duarte examined the marks with a more practical eye. Could be a capybara. They grow substantial in these waters. He was already moving back toward the canoes, unwilling to waste time on speculation. We press on. We've many miles yet before a suitable camp. I made a quick sketch of the marks in my journal, noting their depth and spacing. My medical training had taught me to observe and record even when meaning remained elusive. The grooves measured 32 inches apart at their widest point. No capybara I'd encountered approached such dimensions. We continued deeper into the tributary system, following Araujo's directions through a maze of channels that all appeared identical to my European eyes. The afternoon heat became oppressive, a physical presence that pressed down like a hot cloth against the face. Sweat soaked through my linen shirt within minutes and never dried. There was nowhere for moisture to evaporate in air already saturated. Near a bend where the current created a small eddy, we encountered the carcass. It had been a capybara once, a large one, perhaps 70 pounds in life. Now it lay wedged amongst a tangle of branches, its body distorted in a way that made my medical training snap to attention. The ribcage had collapsed inward, compressed as though by enormous pressure applied from all sides simultaneously. There were no tooth marks, no signs of tearing or predation. The animal had been crushed, methodically, completely, and then discarded. Cayman, said Ramos, but again without conviction. We'd all seen cayman kills before. They drowned their prey or tore chunks from it with their rolling death spin. They didn't crush. Father Celestino made the sign of the cross and muttered something about suffering. Araujo prodded the carcass with his paddle, and it shifted sickeningly before sliding beneath the water with barely a splash. Dobby stepped back from the gunnel, and I noticed his hand move to touch a small leather pouch he wore around his neck. Constriction, I said aloud, more to organize my own thoughts than to inform the others. Something wrapped around it and applied pressure until the bones gave way. An anaconda, perhaps. Anacondas don't grow that large, said Captain Duarte flatly. Not here. But I'd read accounts from further south, near the Pantanal, of anacondas exceeding 20 feet. And I'd learned to treat the phrase "not here" with suspicion in a place where every mile revealed some new excess of nature. We paddled on, but the mood had shifted. Ramos checked his powder more frequently. Father Celestino's prayers grew slightly louder. Even Captain Duarte glanced at the water between his compass readings. Late afternoon brought us to a pair of traders, father and son, judging by their features, hauling a dugout canoe onto a sandbar. They had a small collection of Brazil nuts and dried fish, the standard currency of the interior. Their eyes moved constantly, never quite settling on us, always drawn back to the banks and the water. Araujo hailed them in Ngatu, the trade language, and a brief conversation followed. I caught enough words to understand we were asking about the route ahead. The older trader's response was longer and more emphatic than a simple navigational answer required. What does he say? Captain Duarte demanded. Arauja hesitated, choosing his words carefully. He says the lake we seek is the home of the Water Mother. He says the trees there lean away from the shore as if in fear. He says we should not go there. Water Mother? I asked. Cobra Grande. Arauja said quietly. Great serpent, but more than serpent. Old, very old. Captain Duarte's expression hardened. Superstition. Noted in your journal as such, he instructed me. Local folklore designed to discourage competition for resources. But he offered the traders tobacco nonetheless. And we parted with formal politeness that did nothing to mask the traders' relief at seeing us continue upstream. As evening approached, the tributary grew stranger. A thin film appeared on the water's surface where a side channel joined ours, an oily, iridescent sheen that caught the fading light and threw back rainbow colors. The smell was pungent and musky, like something between a reptile house and a marsh at low tide. What causes this? I asked, dipping a glass vial into the film to collect a sample. The water sweats, said Father Celestino cryptically. He'd wrapped a cloth around his face against the smell. It releases what it must have sustained itself. This was the kind of poetic non-answer I'd come to expect from the priest when he encountered things that troubled his scientific training. But I noticed that Arauja steered us carefully into the clearest water, avoiding the thickest concentrations of the film. We made camp on a raised area where the ground was merely damp rather than submerged. Setting up took an hour. Cutting palm fronds for a lean-to, building a fire ring with stones hauled up from the water, stringing hammocks between trees that leaked sap and hosted colonies of biting insects. The fire resisted lighting, smoldering wetly for a long time before finally catching enough to boil water for tea. Dinner was hardtack softened in broth and strips of salted pork that had already begun to smell despite the salt. We ate without much conversation, each man occupied with his own discomforts. Davi ate quickly and then moved to sit at the very edge of firelight, staring out at the darkness beyond. I spent the evening hours cataloging the day's specimens. Several interesting ferns, a beetle with remarkable iridescent wing cases, samples of the surface film. My notes were becoming harder to write as the humidity warped the paper and made the ink spread in fuzzy lines. Science, I reflected, was considerably easier to practice in a proper laboratory than in a dripping forest with mosquitoes, treating every exposed bit of skin as a feast. Night fell absolutely, the darkness so complete that the fire seemed to create reality itself, beyond which lay only void. The sounds changed, day birds replaced by night birds, the rustle of the canopy transformed into something more ominous, punctuated by splashes and calls that I couldn't identify. I was drifting towards sleep when something bumped the canoe. It was not a violent impact, just a soft thud against the hull, followed by a pause, then a longer scraping sound that traveled from bow to stern with deliberate slowness. The sound was wrong somehow, neither wood nor stone, but something else sliding against the canoe's exterior. I lay rigid in my hammock, counting heartbeats in the darkness. Around me, I heard the others shifting, and knew they'd heard it too. No one spoke. The scraping stopped. Minutes passed. The fire crackled and sent up a small shower of sparks. "Submerged log," whispered Captain Duarte finally, though we all knew the canoes had been pulled well above the waterline. Yes, I agreed, because agreeing allowed us all to return to our attempts at sleep. But I lay awake for a long time afterward, listening to the water lap against the bank, and wondering what kind of log moved with such purpose. Morning revealed what I'd half-hoped imagination had invented. A shallow furrow in the sand beside the canoes, as though something broad and heavy had pressed against them and tested their weight. The furrow was too uniform to be from tide or current. The water level hadn't changed perceptibly overnight. I examined it in the growing light, whilst the others prepared breakfast. The depression was approximately 8 inches wide and ran parallel to both canoes for several feet. At one end, the sand showed a curious pattern, like scales pressed into wet clay. "We should photograph this," I said to Captain Duarte, knowing even as I spoke that our photographic equipment was too cumbersome and moisture-sensitive for such field work. "We should continue," he replied, which ended that discussion. The river changed character after we launched that morning. The trees drew back from the banks, leaving margins of exposed mud studded with the nematophores of mangroves. It was as though the forest itself was reluctant to touch the water here. The channels deepened. Our paddles no longer found purchase on the bottom with their full length, and the water took on a peculiar clarity in its blackness, like looking into deep obsidian. Bird calls, which had provided constant commentary since we'd entered the tributary system, ceased entirely. The silence pressed against my ears until I could hear the blood moving through my own head. "This is unnatural," Father Celestino said quietly. "Nature abhors a vacuum." I replied, falling back on received wisdom. "Something dominates this territory. Other species avoid competition." "And what dominates it?" he asked. I had no answer that wouldn't sound like I'd been seduced by local superstition. By midday, we reached the lake's entrance. It announced itself gradually, the channel widening, the current dissipating, until suddenly we found ourselves facing an expanse of still water that stretched perhaps 2 miles across. The far shore was visible as a dark line of vegetation, but the intervening space seemed to exist in a different category than mere river or pond. The water here was ancient, indifferent, waiting. 2 poles stood at the entrance, each wrapped in woven grass that had been recently replaced. The fibers were still green and flexible. Feathers hung from them, along with what appeared to be small carved figures. The poles were clearly markers, warnings, possibly sacred boundaries. Davi, who had barely spoken a dozen words since we departed, suddenly found his voice. "We should not pass these." He touched one of the hanging figures, a crude representation of a serpent, its body coiled into an impossible spiral. "This is a place where they make offerings. To go further is to accept what comes." Arauja stood silent in the bow, his expression carefully neutral, which told me more than agreement would have done. This was a man who had guided countless expeditions into difficult country, who had faced rapids and storms and dangerous animals with professional calm. But here at the entrance to this unnamed lake, he stood as still as the markers themselves. Captain Duarte's jaw tightened. I recognized the look. It was the expression of a man confronting the choice between prudence and failure, between respecting what he didn't understand and completing the mission that justified his salary. "We will skirt the margins," he announced. "We mark our positions, take bearings, collect specimens, and depart. We do not linger. We do not cross the deep water." Agreed? It was less agreement than acknowledgement that he'd made his decision regardless of our input, but it was also as cautious as I'd ever heard him be, which perhaps should have comforted me more than it did. Father Celestino stood and made an elaborate sign of the cross over the water, murmuring a prayer in Latin that I recognized as a blessing for travelers in perilous lands. The gesture seemed both too little and somehow presumptuous, asking Christian protection in a place that predated Christianity by uncounted centuries. We glided past the markers into the lake proper. The water's surface held a pale scum near the shore, thicker than the film we'd encountered the previous day. It parted around our hulls with a sound like tearing silk, and closed again behind us. The smell intensified, that musk that suggested reptiles and rot, and something else I couldn't quite identify. It got into your throat and stayed there. I trailed my hand in the water, without thinking, then jerked it back as though burned. The water was cold, shockingly so compared to the tributary's warmth, and possessed a peculiar density, almost oily. "Don't touch it," Arauja said sharply. "The water here carries memory. It remembers hands and returns them in dreams." "Arauja," Captain Duarte said warningly, but the guide shook his head. "Some warnings are not superstition. Captain, some warnings are simply warnings." We paddled along the margin, moving clockwise around the lake's perimeter. Bubbles rose occasionally in clusters, breaking the surface with small pops that released more of that musky smell. I counted the intervals between bubble clusters, trying to find pattern or rhythm, but there was none that I could detect. Near a stand of half-submerged trees, something caught the light beneath the surface. I signaled for Arauja to bring us closer, and we drifted until the object came into clearer view. It was a shed skin, a massive section of translucent epidermis, still showing the clear impression of scales. It undulated in some invisible current, and when Arauja maneuvered us alongside, I was able to lift a section with my paddle. The scale pattern was distinctive, large diamond shapes with smaller hexagonal scales between them, typical of constrictors. But the size... I held it up, letting it drape across my paddle blade. Each diamond-shaped scale was the size of my palm. Mother of God, breathed Father Celestino. I carefully laid the skin across the thwart and took measurements with my cloth tape. With 47 inches at the widest point, the thickness of the epidermis, nearly a quarter inch. Extrapolating from known species ratios, this came from an animal measuring somewhere between 40 and 50 feet in length and perhaps 3 feet in diameter at its thickest point. This can't be accurate, I said, though I was speaking to myself rather than the others. No anaconda grows to such dimensions. No anaconda that you've measured, said Captain Duarte quietly. His face had gone pale beneath its tan. Pack it carefully. Document it fully. And for God's sake, don't tell me what you think it means. Because what it meant was obvious and terrifying, and we were floating in its territory with nothing but wooden canoes and a single musket between ourselves and whatever had shed the skin. The breathing came shortly afterward. It wasn't loud, more of a prolonged exhalation than a gasp, but it was unmistakably the sound of air being expelled from lungs through a wet passage. It came from beneath the surface somewhere ahead of us, resonated through the water itself, and was followed by complete silence. Then, perhaps 2 minutes later, it came again from a different location, off toward the center of the lake. We stopped paddling by unspoken consensus. The canoes drifted, caught in some subtle current that pulled us slightly toward deeper water. I felt my chest constrict, every instinct screaming to turn about and flee, but I forced myself to remain still, to observe, to think. Whatever breathed beneath this lake was large enough that its respiration cycle was measured in minutes rather than seconds. It was also awake and aware of us and choosing to remain submerged. The third breath came from very close to our port side, so close that I saw the water bulge slightly before the sound emerged. Ramos swung his musket toward it, but Captain Duarte hissed at him to lower the weapon. "We do nothing," Duarte said very quietly, "unless it surfaces. Do you understand? We remain calm. We remain quiet. We continue our circuit." It was sensible advice that ignored the fundamental terror of being in the water with something that might be capable of swallowing a man whole. But it was also the only advice that offered any path forward other than panic. We paddled with careful, quiet strokes, keeping close to the shore. The breathing continued at irregular intervals, sometimes close, sometimes distant, always from beneath, never from above. We reached a small rise where exposed roots provided enough purchase to allow us to disembark. Captain Duarte called a halt, and we gratefully climbed onto relatively solid ground. My legs shook, whether from the paddling or the adrenaline, I couldn't say. I took the shed skin to what little shade existed and measured it properly, recording every detail in my journal. The others spoke in low voices behind me, but I was grateful for the mechanical tasks of science, the comfort of measurement and documentation. Numbers didn't care how frightened you were. Behind me, I heard Davi arguing with a Rauja in their own language. The boy's voice was tight with fear or anger, possibly both, and whilst I couldn't understand words, the meaning was clear. We should leave. Now, before it's too late. Arauja's response was longer and carried a tone of weary resignation. He was acknowledging the danger whilst explaining why they would continue anyway. Because they'd been hired. Because the Europeans paid well. Because turning back meant admitting that the warnings had been correct, and that would cost them future employment. Ramos, meanwhile, had found his swagger again now that we were on dry land. "Whatever it is," he said loudly enough to ensure we all heard, "it bleeds. And if it bleeds, it dies. One good shot to the head or heart. We'll have a trophy worth more than this entire expedition salary." Father Celestino gave him a look of such profound disappointment that even Ramos seemed to feel it. You speak of killing something you don't understand in a place you haven't bothered to respect. This is the reasoning of a fool or a child. "I'm a soldier," Ramos snapped back. "I don't need to understand something to kill it." "Then you are a poor soldier," the priest replied. "For the best soldiers I've known understood that some battles are won by avoiding the fight entirely." Before the argument could escalate, the water darkened ahead. It wasn't a shadow. The sky held no clouds. It was a moving patch of deeper black within the black water, sliding beneath the surface like a vast stain spreading through fabric. The patch moved with purpose, slow and steady, following the curve of the shoreline perhaps 50 yards out. We all fell silent, watching. The dimensions were difficult to judge from our angle, but the patch had to be at least 30 feet long, possibly longer, and perhaps 8 feet wide. It moved without creating waves, without disturbing the surface beyond a slight depression as it displaced water. I thought of whales I'd seen from a ship once, breaching near the Azores, and how their movements had sent up great plumes of spray. This created nothing. It was a presence felt more through the water's response than through any visible disturbance. The patch continued its circuit, passing our position without slowing or altering course. It seemed to be patrolling, claiming territory, reminding anything else in the water that this space belonged to alone. Only when it had moved well beyond us did Ramos lower his musket, which I noticed he'd raise without conscious decision. "Mother of God," he whispered. His earlier bravado vanished. "How do you kill something like that?" "You don't," said Araujo simply. "You respect it. You leave offerings and you pray it allows you to pass. That is how." Captain Duarte was staring at the water where the patch had been, his expression unreadable. I saw his hands tighten on his compass, as though it were an anchor to rationality. Then he turned to us, and his voice carried a quality I hadn't heard before, not quite fear, but acknowledgement of it. "We return to the canoes. We complete the circuit by keeping to the shallowest water we can find. We document what we observe, but we do not attempt to collect further specimens or attract attention. Is this understood?" We all nodded. "And Sergeant Ramos," Duarte continued, "your musket remains lowered unless I give explicit orders otherwise. We are scientists and explorers, not hunters. We are here to witness and record, not to conquer." It was perhaps the most sensible thing I'd heard him say since we departed, and it terrified me precisely because it suggested he'd finally grasped what we were facing. We returned to canoes and pushed off with careful, quiet movements. The breathing had stopped, which was somehow worse than when it had continued. At least the breathing gave us a way to track position and distance. Silence meant it could be anywhere. We stayed within 20 feet of shore, scraping bottom occasionally despite the lake's depth. Better to damage our hulls on submerged roots than drift into deeper water, where that massive shape could rise from beneath. The afternoon sun began its descent, throwing long shadows across the lake. We needed to complete the circuit and find camp before darkness fell. The thought of being on this water at night was more than I could contemplate with any equanimity, and then, without any warning whatsoever, it attacked. The water bulged. That was the only precursor, a sudden swelling of the surface near the other canoe, and then a massive shape erupted upward with shocking speed. It slammed down across Araujo's bow with the force of a falling tree, driving the front half of the canoe beneath the surface instantly. Water erupted upward, catching the light, and I had a single crystalline moment to see exactly what struck us. The body was as thick as a barrel, scaled in dark diamonds, glistening with water and that oily scum. It showed perhaps 12 feet of length, coiled and flexing, before sliding back beneath the surface. But it was the power of it that stunned me, the casual, enormous force with which it had struck the canoe and driven it downward as though it weighed nothing at all. Davi vanished into reeds with short, sharp cry of terror. Araujo held his paddle in both hands and brought it down on the serpent's body as it withdrew, a futile gesture, like striking an oak tree with a switch, but the only response his instinct allowed. The paddle struck with a flat crack, and the body barely registered the impact. Ramos fired his musket in the same instant, pure reaction rather than aimed shot. The ball struck somewhere behind where the head would have been, and simply vanished into the water with a small gout of spray. The smoke rolled low across the surface, acrid and out of place. "Davi," I shouted without thinking, my voice too loud in the sudden chaos. The reeds moved. Two separate disturbances, one possibly the boy thrashing, the other something else entirely. Araujo dropped his broken paddle and plunged his arm into the vegetation, groping frantically. For a terrible moment, I thought he'd be pulled in as well, but then he hauled backward, and Davi emerged, coughing and wild-eyed, clutching at his cousin's arm. Blood ran from a gash on the boy's cheek, probably from reed edges rather than anything worse, but it looked horrific in the stark sunlight. His eyes had a glazed quality, pupils blown wide with shock. We bailed frantically, using our hands, gourds, anything. The other canoe had taken on perhaps 50 gallons of water and sat dangerously low. Arauj examined the bow, and I saw his expression tighten. The wood had cracked, deep parallel grooves where something had pressed with tremendous force. There! Captain Duarte pointed at a small hammock of land, barely large enough to qualify as an island, ringed with roots and drift. We make repairs. No one argued. We paddled with sharp, controlled strokes, every paddle dip feeling like an invitation for another strike. The water around us seemed to pulse with unseen movement. I kept catching phantom ripples at the edge of my vision, my mind inventing threats where only surface tension existed. We reached the hammock and dragged both canoes partially onto the mud. My hands shook as I began unpacking repair materials. Fibers, resin, cloths. The medical part of my mind noted the symptoms of shock I was experiencing. Tachycardia, tunnel vision, trembling extremities. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to count my breaths, to engage the rational part of my brain that understood shock could be managed. Father Celestino tended to Davi's face with surprising gentleness, cleaning the cut with water from his blessed canteen and binding it with a strip torn from his own shirt. "You're alive," he said to the boy. "You remain so by staying close and staying vigilant. God has given you a second chance today. Don't squander it." I spread the resin with shaking hands, pressing fibers into the cracks, sealing them as best I could. The work was poor. Proper repairs would take hours we didn't have, but it would hold. Probably, possibly. Ramos stood watch with his musket, scanning the water, jumping at every ripple. I noticed his lips moving and realized he was praying. The habitual words of the rosary, probably learned in childhood, coming back to him now that his soldier's confidence had been shattered. Arauja crouched beside Davi, checking his limbs for breaks, speaking in low tones in their own language. The boy had still not found his voice beyond that initial cry. He stared at the water with the fixed attention of prey that has just escaped the predator and knows it will be hunted again. The resin set in the fierce heat, faster than it would have in cooler climates. I pressed my thumb against it and felt a hold. Not perfect, but functional. We might survive this after all. Then the water around our hammock began to move. Not violently, that was almost worse. Just slow, deliberate circles forming around our tiny island. 3 distinct paths that tightened with each rotation. I could see the surface depression where each body moved beneath, creating a moving ridge that caught the declining sunlight. 3 of them, or one impossibly long creature, moving in a complex pattern. I couldn't tell which possibility terrified me more. "Back to the boats," I said, surprising myself by speaking first. "We cannot remain here." Captain Duarte stared at the circling patterns, his face pale. "We wait for nightfall. They hunt by movement. They hunt by heat," Arauja said quietly. "They feel us through the water, through the ground. Darkness means nothing to them." "Then what do you suggest?" Duarte snapped, his composure finally cracking. "We move now. We stay close. We do not separate, and we pray they choose to let us leave." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was the only plan anyone offered. We loaded into canoes, Ramos joining our boat since the other rowed lower and more precarious, and pushed off into those circling patterns. The Serpents, I had given up pretending they were anything else, adjusted their paths immediately. The circles widened, creating a channel toward deeper water. They were hurting us, I realized with cold certainty, moving us away from the shallows where we'd sought safety, out toward the center where they would have every advantage. "Starboard," I said sharply. "Turn starboard toward that gap in the trunks." Captain Duarte responded instantly, adjusting our course. We drove toward a narrow passage between 2 dead trees, barely wide enough for a canoe. If we could reach it, the constriction would work in our favor. Something that large couldn't follow through such a tight space. But they'd anticipated us. Or perhaps they simply knew their territory better than we did. The lead serpent, if there was such a thing in a group of ambushed predators, broke its circle and surged forward. I saw the water rise as its back breached, a ridge of dark scales breaking the surface for just an instant before it dove. IT struck from below. The impact lifted our entire canoe half a hand span out of the water and drove us sideways. We slammed back down, water pouring over the gunnels, and for a horrible moment, I thought we were going over completely. But the hull held, settling heavily, and we remained upright through sheer fortune rather than any skill. I felt the scrape along our keel, not wood on wood, but something harder, smoother, like polished stone dragging the length of our vessel. The sound traveled to the hull and into my bones, a sensation I can still recall with perfect clarity years later. Ramos fired wildly, the ball striking water where nothing visible presented itself as a target. The noise was deafening in confined space, my ears ringing, the smoke obscuring everything for crucial seconds. When it cleared, I saw the second serpent rising ahead of us. The head broke surface slowly, deliberately, with the confidence of a predator that had never known fear. It was broader than a man's chest, roughly triangular, with a blunt snout and eyes set far apart. The eyes were black, pupils indistinguishable from iris, with a slight milkiness over the left one. Old damage, perhaps, or simply the patina of age. The nostrils flared, each one large enough to admit my fist, and the exhalation that came out smelled of carrion and stagnant water, and something else, something musky and reptilian, that triggered every primal fear humans had ever possessed regarding predators. The mouth opened a fraction, not a threat display, I realized, but simply testing the air. Inside, I glimpsed rows of backward curving teeth, not designed for tearing, but for gripping and holding whilst the body did its terrible work of constriction. We froze, every paddle stilled. Even our breathing seemed to pause. The head swayed slightly, side to side, and I understood we were being assessed, measured, evaluated as potential prey, or potential threat, or simply as curiosities that had invaded its territory. Time elongated. I became aware of individual sounds. Water dripping from Ramos's paddle blade, Father Celestino's whispered prayer, the creak of wood as someone shifted weight, the distant call of some bird that had braved his cursed place. Then Captain Duarte broke the paralysis. "Stroke," he commanded, his voice cracking with tension but carrying authority nonetheless. We drove our paddles into the water with desperate strength. The serpent's head tracked our movement but didn't strike. It simply watched as we fled, sliding back beneath the surface with barely a ripple, as though deciding we weren't worth the effort or that the game had grown boring. We reached the gap between the dead trunks and squeezed through, scraping bark from both sides, not caring about the damage. Shallow water meant safety. Confinement meant protection. We'd take any advantage geography offered. The current caught us on the far side, actual flowing water rather than the lake's oppressive stillness, and pulled us gratefully downstream, away from the lake, away from those circling presences, away from that ancient, patient intelligence that had measured us and found us not worth consuming. We paddled with frantic energy until our arms burned and our shoulders screamed protest. The channel narrowed, deepened, began to resemble a proper river rather than a lake's feeding tributary. Trees closed overhead. Bird calls resumed. The world slowly reassembled itself into something recognizable. Only when the lake had disappeared behind two bends and a kilometer of river did Captain Duarte finally call a halt. We drifted into a small eddy, both canoes so low in the water from the weight we'd taken on that the gunnels rode barely 3 inches above the surface. "We bail," Duarte said, his voice hoarse. "Then we continue. We do not stop again until we put 10 kilometers between ourselves and that place." No one argued. We bailed in silent efficiency, using every container we possessed until our arms ached and the canoes rode properly again. Then we paddled, keeping a steady rhythm that ate distance without conversation. Davy had not spoken since being pulled from the reeds. He sat in the middle of Araujo's canoe, staring forward, his hand periodically rising to touch the cut on his cheek, as though reassuring himself he still existed in physical form. I recognized the 1,000-yard stare, the psychological distance trauma creates between mind and body. He would need time to return to himself, if he ever fully did. Ramos had stopped his habitual weapons maintenance. The musket lay across his knees, still loaded, and his hands gripped the paddle with white knuckles that suggested he was holding it less for propulsion and more as the only solid thing in an unraveling world. Father Celestino prayed openly now, voice carrying across the water, no longer concerned with discretion or dignity. The words were Latin, ancient formal, designed to invoke protection from powers that predated the New World, but which he hoped might extend their jurisdiction here. Araujo paddled with mechanical precision, his face expressionless, though I saw his eyes constantly scanning the water ahead. This was a man reassessing everything he believed about navigable rivers and acceptable risks. And Captain Duarte, I watched him from my position and saw something fundamental had broken. Not his courage, he still set our course, still made decisions, but his certainty. He'd encountered something that his charts couldn't explain, that his instruments couldn't measure, that his experience couldn't contextualize. The world had revealed itself to be larger and stranger than Portuguese maps admitted, and that revelation had cost him something essential. We made no camp that night. Instead, we lashed the canoes together and drifted with the current, taking turns sleeping whilst others kept watch. I don't know if anyone actually slept. I lay in the bottom of the canoe, staring up at stars visible through breaks in the canopy, and try to reconcile what I'd witnessed with what I'd been taught in Edinburgh's medical schools. Constrictors of that size should not exist, could not exist. The square cube law alone, the relationship between volume and surface area, meant that animals beyond a certain scale couldn't support their own weight on land or generate enough metabolic heat to remain active. Python reticulatus, the longest reliably documented snake species, maxed out around 25 feet. Anacondas perhaps 30, with most reports being exaggerations or hoaxes. But I'd measured that shed skin. I'd seen the body strike our canoe. I'd looked into those ancient, patient eyes. Science, I realized, was a European construct. We'd built it in laboratories and lecture halls, insulated from the raw immensity of the world. We created laws and classifications based on what we'd encountered in our limited sphere of experience, then assumed those laws applied universally. But what if there were places, deep forests, remote lakes, territories humans had only recently touched, where different rules applied, where evolution had taken paths we hadn't documented because we'd never thought to look? The Amazon was larger than Western Europe. Most of it had never felt a European boot. Portuguese control extended only along major rivers and coastal areas. Everything else was unknown territory, marked on maps with speculation and fantasy. Perhaps the fantasy was closer to truth than the speculation. Dawn found us perhaps 30 kilometers downstream from the lake, in water that ran clear and fast between normal banks where normal trees grew in normal fashion. The world had returned to mundane reality, though none of us trusted it. We pulled into a clay bank to properly assess damage and reorganize supplies. The patched canoe had held through the night, but needed reinforcement. Both vessels showed scrapes and gouges that would require attention before they could be considered sound. We've lost most of our specimens, I reported to Captain Duarte after inventorying our supplies. The collection chest took on water. Everything's ruined except the shed skin, which I wrapped in oilcloth. The skin is enough, he replied quietly. More than enough. We have proof. Proof of what exactly? That large anacondas exist. He looked at me with hollow eyes. Proof that the warnings were correct, that some territories aren't meant for mapping, that the Crown's ambitions have limits. It was the most honest thing I'd heard him say, and also the saddest. A lifetime of expanding Portuguese knowledge into blank spaces, and he finally found one that had refused to be known. We worked through the morning making repairs, speaking little. Father Celestino conducted a brief service, thanking God for our survival and asking protection for the remainder of our journey. His hand shook slightly as he raised communion cup. We'd run out of wine days ago, so he used river water blessed with prayer, and I saw tears in his eyes as he administered the sacrament. Araujo and Davi sat apart from us, the boy's head resting on his cousin's shoulder. Araujo spoke in low tones, probably explaining that what they'd witnessed wasn't their fault, that some forces existed beyond human influence or responsibility. The boy nodded occasionally but never responded. That silence would follow him for the rest of our journey, and from what I learned years later, for the rest of his life. By midday, we were ready to continue. The current here flowed reliably toward the main river, requiring minimal paddling. We let it carry us, conserving strength, all of us unconsciously keeping our paddles ready despite the apparent calm. We didn't speak of turning back toward the lake. The circuit remained unmapped, the bearings incomplete, the botanical specimens uncollected. Our mission was a failure by every metric that mattered to Crown. But we were alive, and that seemed achievement enough. The river widened gradually over the next 2 days. The canopy receded. We began to pass occasional fishing camps, small temporary structures where indigenous families came during certain seasons. The people watched us paddle past with expressions that suggested they knew where we'd been and were unsurprised to see us fleeing downstream. At one camp, an old woman called out in Ngadu as we passed. Arauja responded, and they exchanged several sentences. After we'd moved beyond earshot, I asked what she'd said. She asked if we'd seen the Water Mother. He replied. I told her yes. She asked if we'd left offerings. I told her no. She said we were fortunate to be alive, and that the Water Mother must have been recently fed to let us pass. Recently fed on what? I asked, though I wasn't certain I wanted the answer. Arauja shrugged. The forest provides. Always. On the third day after leaving the lake, we encountered something that stopped us cold. A canoe drifted toward us, empty, spinning slowly in an eddy. It was a vessel belonging to the 2 traders we'd met on our way upstream. I recognized the distinctive patterns carved into its bow. We approached cautiously and pulled alongside. The canoe was intact, showed no damage, but was completely empty. No supplies, no bodies, no signs of struggle. Just an empty vessel drifting back downstream as though the river itself was returning lost property. Inside the hull, scratched into the wood with something sharp, was a single word in Portuguese. Oferenda, offering. Father Celestino made the sign of the cross and turned away. Ramos lifted his musket, though what he intended to shoot remained unclear. Captain Duarte stared at the scratched word for a long moment before ordering us to continue. Should we not investigate? I asked, knowing even as I spoke that investigation was pointless. There's nothing to investigate, Duarte replied flatly. They went back, and the lake took its price. That's all we need to know. We left the empty canoe spinning in the eddy and paddled on. The main river, when we finally reached it 5 days after fleeing the lake, felt like a return to civilization despite being hundreds of kilometers from any Portuguese settlement. It was wide, well-traveled, appearing on official charts. Here, the rules we understood applied. Caimans were only caimans. Anacondas grew to reasonable sizes. The water was merely water, without memory or malice. We made camp on a proper sandbank that first night, our first fire since the lake. The flames felt like a talisman against the darkness we'd experienced. Ramos cleaned his musket thoroughly, restoring routine and order to his world one mechanical action at a time. Father Celestino read from his breviary by firelight, the Latin phrases of comfort of civilization and structure. Arauja and Davi sat close to each other, the boy occasionally speaking a few words. The first I'd heard from him in days. Whatever had been said between them, some small healing had begun, though the fundamental damage would never fully repair. Captain Duarte spread his charts one final time, staring at the blank space where the lake existed. He made no marks, added no notations. After a long silence, he carefully folded the charts and returned them to their oilcloth wrapping. I will report that the territory is unsuitable for development, he said quietly. Impassable terrain, dangerous wildlife, no resources worth the risk. That will be my official recommendation. And unofficially, I asked. He looked at me with those hollow eyes. Unofficially, I will suggest that some places are meant to remain on the map as blank spaces, that the world requires mysteries, that trying to illuminate everything leaves us blind to what we cannot understand. It was philosophy, coming from a man who'd spent his life opposing it with empirical measurement. But then, we'd all changed on that lake. We'd all encountered something that required reassessment of fundamental assumptions. I spent the voyage back to Barcelos writing my formal report. It was deliberately vague, large constrictors, challenging terrain, incomplete survey due to seasonal flooding. I included precise measurements of the shed skin, but attributed it to Unex murinus, the common anaconda, noting only that it represented an unusually large specimen worthy of further study. The skin itself, carefully preserved in alcohol, would eventually make its way to the Crown's Natural History Collection, where it would be measured and admired and generate papers about individual variation within known species. No one would question whether it came from something categorically different. Science preferred to expand boundaries of known classifications rather than admit entirely new ones. My private journal, the one I kept separate from official documentation, told the fuller truth. But I knew even as I wrote it that it would never be published, never be taken seriously if it was. I was documenting something for myself alone, bearing witness even if that witness would never be believed. We reached Barcelos in late April, 2 weeks behind schedule, missing half our supplies and with nothing to show for our expedition except one shed skin and hollow eyes. The governor received our report with barely concealed disappointment. He'd expected charts, specimens, intelligence about indigenous populations and potential resources. Captain Duarte delivered his recommendations in a flat, professional tone that brooked no argument. The territory was unsuitable for development. Further expeditions would be wasteful. The Crown's interests were better served elsewhere. The governor protested. Of course. Resources have been expended, expectations created, but something in Duarte's manner, some fundamental certainty in his rejection, eventually convinced the official to accept the recommendation. The lake would remain blank on Portuguese charts, unmapped and unexplored. Araujo and Davi were paid their fees and departed immediately, declining the governor's offer of future employment. I watched them leave, the boy walking close to his cousin, and wondered what stories they would tell their own people. Warnings, probably. Instructions to avoid that territory. To respect the markers. To leave offerings if circumstances ever required passage. Ramos requested immediate transfer back to coastal duties. His petition was granted. The garrison commander took one look at him and recognized a soldier who'd encountered something beyond training or preparation. He was reassigned to Harbor Patrol, where the worst threats came from smugglers and drunken sailors rather than from the black water itself. Father Celestino remained in Barcelos for 3 more years before accepting a transfer to a mission upriver in the opposite direction from the lake. He continued his botanical work, his ministry, his careful negotiation between indigenous wisdom and Christian doctrine, but he never again agreed to guide expeditions into unmapped territory. He learned there were things prayer couldn't protect against, knowledge that faith couldn't reconcile. Captain Duarte died 2 years later, not from disease or violence, but from what the physicians called melancholia. He'd lost something essential on that lake, the certainty that had driven his life's work. And without it, he'd simply stopped. He ceased eating properly, ceased sleeping, ceased seeing purpose in continued existence. I visited him once before the end, and he looked at me with those same hollow eyes and whispered, "We weren't meant to see that. Some things are too large for human comprehension. We were insects that survived because we fled quickly enough." I returned to my medical practice in the capital, married, had children, lived an ordinary life, but I kept that private journal, and sometimes late at night, I would open it and read the descriptions of what we witnessed. And I would remember the breathing from beneath the black water, the patient eyes that had measured us, the casual, enormous power that struck our canoe. Years later, 1823, to be precise, I encountered a bear trader in a market in Manaus. He was selling medicinal plants and carved figures, and amongst his wares I saw a small serpent carved in dark wood, coiled in that same impossible spiral-eyed scene on the warning markers. I asked him about it. He looked at me carefully, assessing, then asked quietly if I'd been to the lake. When I nodded, he told me that the water mother was older than memory, that she'd lived in that lake since before humans came to forest, that she was not merely an animal but something else, a guardian, a boundary, a reminder that humans were newcomers in a world that preceded them by unimaginable spans. Does she still live? I asked. He smiled slightly. The lake exists. That is answer enough. I bought the carved serpent and kept it on my desk for the remainder of my life. My children would occasionally ask about it, and I would tell them it represented the Amazon's mysteries, the unknown territories, the blank spaces on the map. They assumed I was being metaphorical. I never corrected them. I write this now in my 73rd year, knowing I likely haven't many more. My hands shake with age. The ink spreads unevenly across the page, and my memory occasionally betrays me in small ways. But I remember the lake with perfect clarity. Every detail remains sharp and immediate, as though it happened yesterday rather than 4 decades ago. I've thought extensively over these years about the nature of what we encountered. Scientific classification would call it an exceptionally large Inex murinus, an anaconda of unusual but not impossible dimensions. Cryptozoology, that dubious field where science and folklore blur, might claim it as something undiscovered, requiring new taxonomy. But I think both approaches miss something essential. They assume the framework matters, that naming and categorizing grants understanding. They assume that everything can be measured, documented, fitted into hierarchies of knowledge. What we encountered in that lake existed outside such frameworks. It was ancient when the first humans reached the Amazon. It would remain long after the last Portuguese settlement crumbled and returned to forest. It was not a specimen to be collected or a beast to be conquered. It was a presence, vast and patient, that had made its territory and defended it with the casual efficiency of something that had never lost. The indigenous peoples understood this. They didn't try to hunt it or study it or map its territory. They marked its boundaries with offerings and warnings. They told stories that carried practical wisdom disguised as mythology, and they stayed away. They recognized that some things weren't meant for human interaction, that the world contained powers that exceeded human scale. European science, with its emphasis on empirical knowledge and categorical understanding, struggles with such concepts. We want to know everything, measure everything, explain everything. We believe that sufficient investigation will eventually illuminate any darkness, answer any question. But what if some darkness is meant to remain dark? What if some questions are better left unasked? I never published my account. I never submitted the shed skin with full documentation of its provenance. I made sure that the lake remained blank on official maps. And when younger naturalists occasionally asked about unexplored territories worth investigating, I would quietly discourage them from venturing into that particular region. Some might call this obscurantism or cowardice or betrayal of scientific principles. Perhaps they're right. But I've come to believe that knowledge carries responsibility, and that some knowledge demands respect rather than dissemination. The lake remains. The water mother, if that's what one chooses to call it, continues its patient existence in those black waters. Occasionally, I hear rumors from traders or missionaries about expeditions that vanish in the interior, about canoes found empty, about warnings ignored. And I remember standing on that small hammock, watching the water circle, feeling the pressure of something vast and ancient moving beneath us. I remember the breathing, slow and steady, marking the rhythm of a life measured in scales incomprehensible to human experience. I remember that we survived not through courage or skill, but because we were allowed to survive, because whatever lived in that lake had assessed us and decided we weren't worth the effort of killing. We were insects, briefly interesting, ultimately irrelevant. That knowledge, that humbling, terrifying knowledge, is perhaps the most important thing I carried out of forest. Humans are not the measure of all things. Our understanding is not universal. Our dominion is limited, and the world contains mysteries vast enough to swallow our certainty without trace. The carved serpent sits on my desk still, its spiral coils catching lamplight. My grandchildren sometimes play with it, making up stories about magic snakes and enchanted forests. They're closer to the truth than they know. I've written this account not for publication, but for what? Posterity? Testimony? The simple human need to bear witness? Perhaps I write it because memory demands recording, because what we experience deserves documentation, even if that documentation will never be believed. Or perhaps I write it because on certain nights, when the air is thick and still and reminiscent of the Amazon's oppressive humidity, I swear I can hear it. That slow, steady breathing rising from beneath black water, a rhythm that continues somewhere in the world's vast interior, marking the passage of time in scales humans cannot comprehend. The lake exists. That is answer enough for from the private papers of Dr. Tomás Manuel da Silva, late physician of Rio de Janeiro, discovered amongst his effects following his death in 1853. This manuscript has been preserved by his descendants but never published at his explicit request. Some truths, he wrote in a marginal note, are better whispered than shouted. Let those who need to know find it themselves.